Imagine for a second that you're looking into the historical records of a really foundational civilizational legal code.
Right.
And this code, which dictates the lives of, over 1 billion people today, is incredibly strict. I mean, it requires 4 simultaneous eyewitnesses to a private act just to even bring an accusation forward.
Exactly. A massive evidentiary burden.
Yeah, but then when you ask where the most brutal punishment for this crime comes from, like the mandate to actually bury someone and stone them to death, the historical tradition tells you something absolutely absurd.
Oh, the leaf story.
Yes. You are told that the specific verse was written on a leaf, kept under a bed, and after the founder passed away, a domestic goat just wandered into the room and ate it.
It's wild. I mean, it sounds like magical realism, right? A goat eating the ultimate legal code.
It really does.
But that is an actual documented historical claim that gets used to justify a punishment that literally doesn't exist in the primary text. And I think it perfectly encapsulates the entire crisis we are looking at today.
It's a massive paradox, and that's exactly what we are unraveling. Welcome to today's deep dive, everyone.
Had to be here for this one.
So if you are listening to this, you have very likely seen modern news reports of, public floggings or stoning in certain Muslim-majority states.
Right. Those images circulate everywhere.
And if you are like most people, you see that and think, well, this is just a barbaric medieval relic. So we are tackling the absolute elephant in the room today.
The big one, Surah An-Nur.
Specifically, Ayat 2. In Arabic, it reads, and forgive my pronunciation, Azanyatu wa azani fadlidu kula wahidin minhuma miata jaldah.
Which means flog the woman and the man guilty of adultery or fornication with 100 stripes.
100 stripes. That is the single verse that Western critics universally point to when they want to condemn the entire architecture of Islamic law.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And paradoxically, it's the exact same verse that modern authoritarian states point to when they want to justify their own state-sanctioned violence.
Both sides are pointing to the exact same sentence. But stepping back from the theology for a minute and stepping back from the religious sentimentality, which we are completely leaving at the door today.
Oh, 100%. We need to look at this mechanically.
Right. When we actually analyze this as sociologists and systems engineers, we run into a massive structural problem. Both the critic and the state are reading this text with the exact same fatal flaw.
Yeah, they are extracting a terminal enforcement mechanism from a massive, highly sophisticated social architecture, and they're treating it like a standalone primitive law.
Which makes no sense structurally.
None at all. I mean, it's the equivalent of pulling a single line of code out of a massive operating system, totally ignoring the software it requires to run, and then acting shocked when the machine just completely crashes.
So the mission for this deep dive today is to reconstruct that operating system.
Exactly.
We are going to dissect the source text to prove that the flogging verse only functions, and really only makes logical sense, as the absolute final fail-safe of a justice system.
A system that is designed to do absolutely everything in its power to prevent that punishment from ever being needed in the first place.
Right. Because if a society actually implements the prerequisites that this text demands, that terminal provision almost never activates.
Yeah, it's basically a description of what a perfectly engineered, socioeconomically just system does in an extreme outlier case.
It is absolutely not a mandate for what a broken, unjust system gets to do to its marginalized citizens as a default.
Not at all.
So let's start with the hardware, like the actual text of Surah An-Nur 24.2. I'm looking at the translation here, and the physical mandate is jarring. 100 stripes.
It sounds incredibly intense.
It does. When we talk about engineering a society, physical violence just feels like a very blunt instrument. So what is the actual linguistic mechanic happening here?
Well, we really have to look at the specific Arabic terminology used because the linguistic engineering of this text it's incredibly precise.
Okay, lay it on me.
The word used for the punishment is Jaldah, and this word shares its exact root with jild, which literally translates to skin.
Skin?
Yeah, so the instruction is entirely specific. It means to strike the skin and only the skin.
Meaning it is, by definition, superficial.
Superficial and intentionally survivable. I mean, the historical implementation detailed in the broader source material specifies that the instrument used had to be a single strap of plain leather.
Plain leather, like no modifiers on it.
Right. No knots, no metal tips, no weights attached to it. And it was explicitly forbidden to raise the arm high enough to expose the armpit.
Wait, really? Why the armpit?
Because if you can't raise your arm that high, you physically cannot generate the kind of kinetic force required to lacerate deep tissue or damage internal organs or break bone.
Oh, wow. So it's mathematically calibrated.
Exactly. It was designed to cause severe stinging pain. Sure, it's a psychological and physical deterrent, but it was strictly engineered not to be terminal. The person is meant to walk away from it.
Which brings us right back to the goat.
Ego.
Because if the text, like the primary source code of this entire civilization, specifically mandates something that is survivable and skin deep, we have to explain the code injection.
Right. Where did the lethal bug come from?
Yeah, where did the obsession with Raj stoning to death come from? Because in the public consciousness today, stoning is practically synonymous with this law.
It is. And this is honestly one of the most fascinating examples of sociological regression in human history.
Regression? How so?
Because if you search the foundational source code, the Quran itself, stoning to death as a punishment for this crime is entirely absent. It simply does not exist anywhere in the text.
It's basically a phantom law.
Completely.
So how does a phantom law overwrite the primary text? I mean, I imagine it like updating a highly sophisticated, newly written software program with a virus from a totally obsolete operating system.
That is the perfect way to frame it. The virus in this case was a pre-existing tribal and Jewish legal penalty.
Okay, setting the historical scene.
Right. Remember the context of 7th century Arabia. You're dealing with deeply entrenched, patriarchal, tribal societies that for centuries relied on terminal lethal punishments to control property, lineage, and, specifically the bodies of women.
So terminal violence was their norm.
Exactly. When the new Islamic socio-legal framework was introduced, it actually represented a massive downgrade in physical brutality. It shifted the entire paradigm from terminal elimination to survivable rehabilitation.
And I'm guessing the old guard couldn't handle that shift.
They really couldn't. I mean, a survivable punishment just didn't satisfy the tribal thirst for absolute control or blood vengeance.
That makes sense.
Human psychology naturally resists radical systemic change, especially when that change demands restraint. So over the following centuries, during these periods of political chaos and the compilation of oral traditions, historical narratives began to surface.
Narratives that attempted to import the older lethal punishment back into the system.
Precisely. They needed a workaround. They needed a way to override the Jaldah mandate of the primary text.
And that is where the bizarre historical gymnastics come into play. Because, you can't just cross out a line in a revered text.
No, you'd be called a heretic.
Right. You have to invent a reason why the text is somehow incomplete.
Which leads us to the infamous traditions found in later supplementary texts, like the collection by Ibn Majah. To explain why the mandate for stoning wasn't in the Quran, a narrative was circulated.
The famous leaf story.
Yes. The claim was that a verse prescribing stoning was originally revealed, written down on a piece of parchment or leaf, and kept under the bed of Aisha, the Prophet's wife.
Okay.
And the story goes that during the chaotic days of the Prophet's funeral, a hungry domestic goat wandered into the room and ate the parchment.
I mean, it is genuinely staggering to think about.
Yeah.
We are talking about the foundation of life and death, right?
The ultimate legal architecture of a civilization.
Exactly. And the justification for state-sanctioned execution rests on the digestive tract of a goat. It's the theological equivalent of saying the dog ate my homework, but they're using it to justify capital punishment.
It really highlights the sheer desperation of a tribal mindset that's trying to overwrite systemic logic. And there are other narratives, too.
Ooh, it gets weirder.
Oh, yeah. There are records claiming that companions saw monkeys in the wilderness actually stoning another monkey for committing adultery.
Wait, monkeys?
Yes, monkeys enforcing capital punishment, supposedly proving that stoning is an inescapable natural law.
That is just wild.
But when you look at these traditions through the lens of sociology, they aren't theology, They are epistemological crises.
Artifacts of a society trying to rationalize its own desire for brutality.
Exactly. They are projecting it onto missing leaves and wild animals. But when you strip away that superstitious myth-making and return to the primary source code of Surah An-Nur, the system strictly mandates a non-terminal penalty.
It flat out refuses to strip the individual of their humanity or their life.
Absolutely.
But let's be entirely intellectually honest here for a second. Even if it is skin deep and survivable, 100 stripes is a severe traumatic penalty.
Oh, without a doubt. It's a highly aggressive physical deterrent.
Right, and if a system contains a mechanism that severe, the safeguards around triggering it have to be equally robust. You don't build a nuclear reactor without a containment dome.
That's a great analogy. And the containment dome in this legal architecture is what we can call the evidentiary firewall.
Let's break that down.
This is where the genius of the system really begins to show itself. The preconditions for this verse to activate are so staggering that they fundamentally alter the nature of the crime itself.
Okay, let's look at that primary hurdle. What is the actual burden of proof required to authorize the Jaldah?
To even bring an accusation of zina, which covers both adultery and fornication, the text requires 4 eyewitnesses.
I want to pause here because modern legal terminology can really soften what that actually means.
Right, people hear witnesses and think of something entirely different.
Yeah, if you're listening to this, you might think 4 witnesses means 4 people who saw a couple walking into a hotel room together.
Ooh.
Or, 4 people who saw a suggestive text message or ring camera footage of someone sneaking out of the house.
Circumstantial evidence.
Exactly.
None of that is admissible for this specific charge. The source material is mathematically rigid. It requires Aini Shahid.
Which means?
4 independent eyewitnesses to the actual physical act of penetration itself.
Wow.
The classical jurists described it with graphic precision. The witnesses must see the act as clearly as a stylus entering a coal jar or a rope dropping into a well.
That is basically a titanium vault of evidence.
It really is.
Unless a couple is performing this act on a brightly lit public stage in the middle of a town square at high noon, achieving that specific burden of proof is essentially a mathematical impossibility.
Correct.
How do 4 adults simultaneously witness the mechanical details of a deeply private act without participating or intervening?
They don't, and that impossibility is the feature, not the bug.
The feature. Explain that.
By setting an evidentiary standard that impossibly high, the system basically renders the provision practically unenforceable for private behavior.
So it's a massive privacy firewall.
Exactly. It tells the state, in no uncertain terms, you do not have the jurisdiction, the right, or even the mechanism to police the private bedrooms of your citizens.
Which forces us to totally rethink what the law is actually targeting in the first place.
Right. If the law is impossible to enforce against private vice, then it isn't a law about private morality at all.
It's a public decency law?
A public decency law taken to its absolute terminal failsafe. It is designed to punish the deliberate public destruction of social order.
Because if 4 independent people saw it, it wasn't a private failing, it was a public broadcast.
Exactly. It targets behavior that is so flagrant, so publicly defiant of the social contract, that 4 people can simultaneously witness the physical act.
So the state is basically saying, we don't care what you do behind closed doors because we literally can't legally prove it without violating your privacy.
Yeah.
But if you tear down the fabric of public decency so aggressively that 4 people trip over you in the street, then the state will intervene.
And the system enforces that privacy firewall with terrifying efficiency. Look at what happens to the person who tries to bypass it.
What do you mean?
If someone makes an accusation of zina but cannot produce those 4 physical eyewitnesses to the actual act, the system turns on them instantly.
Oh, this is the law of cause F, right? Outlined just 2 verses later in Surah An-Nur.
Yes. If you make the accusation and fail to bring the 4 witnesses, the accuser themselves is immediately flogged with 80 stripes.
80 stripes just for the false accusation.
And that's not all. Their testimony is permanently rejected in any court of law for the rest of their life. Unless they repent, they are socially and legally bankrupted.
That completely neutralizes the weaponization of the law.
Entirely.
Think about how often accusations of sexual misconduct are used historically and even today as political smear campaigns or just ways to destroy a rival's reputation.
It happens constantly.
But this system fiercely protects the dignity of the accused. If you take a shot at someone's reputation, you better have that mathematically impossible standard of proof, or you will destroy your own standing in society permanently.
It completely prevents a surveillance state from forming. It outlaws that Salem witch trial dynamic where rumors and whispers suddenly become capital offenses.
Right.
The architecture demands that human dignity remains intact. And that protection of dignity extends even further, pushing past the immediate adults to protect the most vulnerable collateral damage of these situations.
You mean the children?
Yes, the children. This is a critical sociological pivot.
Because in almost every classical civilization, and frankly in a lot of modern ones, The child of an illicit relationship bears the brunt of the punishment.
Oh, definitely.
They carry the social stigma of being a quote-unquote bastard. They're denied inheritance. They are treated as a secondary class of citizen.
But the source material explicitly outlaws that entire concept. Within this socioeconomic operating system, the concept of an illegitimate child bearing the stigma of the parent's crime just does not exist.
There's no concept of original sin.
No inherited guilt whatsoever.
So the child carries zero legal or spiritual burden.
None. The system recognizes pure biological and sociological reality. The child had absolutely zero agency in their own conception.
Right, obviously.
So punishing them, denying them resources, or allowing society to treat them as lesser would be a fundamental violation of justice. The state is required to protect that child's standing just as fiercely as it protects anyone else's.
So let's pull back and look at the blueprint we've uncovered so far.
It's quite a blueprint.
We have a punishment that is intentionally engineered to be non-lethal. We have a burden of proof so high it acts as a massive privacy shield. We have life-ruining penalties for false accusations to prevent witch hunts, and we have strict protections for children. If the state's evidentiary bar is this highly tuned, the society in which this operates cannot just be, a random collection of tribal tents. It must be highly engineered.
You literally cannot run this terminal legal code without the proper macroeconomic operating system in place.
The socioeconomic OS.
Yes. The state must first ensure that all economic and social needs are met before it has any moral or legal jurisdiction to raise a whip.
I want to spend a significant time on this because I feel like this is where the modern application of these laws completely falls apart.
It completely disintegrates.
What are the specific prerequisites the state actually has to fulfill? What does this operating system look like in practice?
Well, the foundational requirement is the total eradication of economic desperation.
Okay.
The system operates on the sociological reality that human behavior is inextricably tied to material conditions. If a state wants to enforce laws regarding social order, it must first provide the infrastructure for that order to naturally exist.
You cannot mandate moral perfection in a state of biological starvation.
Exactly. And there is a historical case study that perfectly illustrates this. Regarding the second caliph, Umar ibn al-Khattab.
Ah, yes.
Yeah.
If we want to understand how this system was engineered to work, we have to look at the Year of Ashes.
The Ramada famine. It happened around 18 AH. It was a period of catastrophic drought and starvation in Arabia.
Really dire conditions.
Very dire. During this famine, a group of servants stole and slaughtered a camel belonging to a wealthy man named Hatib ibn Abi Balta. They were caught red-handed and brought before Umar.
And the standard counted punishment for theft, on paper at least, is amputation of the hand.
A completely binary terminal punishment, if you look at it like a flowchart. Steal a camel, lose a hand.
Right.
But Umar didn't look at the flowchart. As the chief executive of the system, he interrogated the material conditions first.
What did he find?
He discovered that these servants were quite literally starving to death because their master, Hatib, was hoarding wealth and not providing them with enough food to survive the famine.
So they didn't steal out of malice or greed. They stole out of raw biological necessity.
Exactly. And Umar's response is the key to understanding the entire legal philosophy. He completely suspended the punishment for the servants.
He didn't even reprimand them.
Not at all. Instead, he summoned Hatib, the wealthy owner, and threatened to penalize him. Umar forced Hatib to pay double the price of the camel to the man whose camel was actually stolen.
Wait, so he essentially taxed the wealthy owner for creating the conditions of theft?
Yes. That completely flips the script on criminal justice.
It really does. Umar ruled that because the economic hierarchy failed to provide the basic necessities of life, the servants could not be held legally culpable.
The state and the hoarding class was the criminal, not the individual who was forced to break the law just to survive.
The logic there is just impenetrable. I mean, if a society allows a human being to reach a point where they are forced to break the law to survive, whether that is stealing food or, being driven into transactional sex work due to crushing poverty,
then the society has broken its contract with the individual.
Right. The individual cannot be punished for navigating a crisis the state itself created.
If we translate this into a modern context, it's like, imagine a city planner fails to build traffic lights at a major 6-lane intersection.
Oh, that's a perfect analogy. It would be pure chaos.
Absolute chaos. And then, when a crash inevitably happens, the city sends a police officer to ticket the drivers for reckless driving.
You cannot legally or morally fine citizens for failing to navigate a hazard that the state was obligated to fix in the first place.
The penalty is mathematically invalid because the infrastructure isn't there. So if we apply this back to Surah An-Nur and the flogging verse, the operating system requires massive economic architecture.
Like what, specifically?
Just a few verses later, in verse 32, the text explicitly commands the society, Ankihu Allama minkum.
Which means?
It mandates the facilitation of marriage for those who are single. It demands that the state and the community actively remove the economic barriers to forming legitimate, stable social units.
Oh, wow. Think about the implications of that for a modern society.
They're huge.
A society where young people cannot afford a home, they are burdened with massive debt, they literally cannot find a living wage job, and they are entirely priced out of starting a family.
Yep.
If that society then turns around and tries to punish people for engaging in relationships outside of marriage, it has failed the system test completely.
It has basically violated its own source code. And the text also specifically addresses the mutabi el-hawa.
Those who follow desire.
That's how it's often translated, but historically it referred to enslaved or economically bound people who couldn't marry without the consent of their owners.
Okay, what does the surah say about them?
The surah instructs that they be provided for and explicitly commands owners to grant them paths to freedom and economic independence.
So the state must eliminate the conditions that drive people to transactional sex.
Exactly. Which means that executing a punishment like flogging without first building this massive supportive socioeconomic architecture is not Islamic law.
It's just state violence wearing a religious mask.
It is the ultimate perversion of the text. Applying the final failsafe while intentionally ignoring the hundreds of prerequisites is a tyrannical extraction. It produces the exact opposite of justice.
But, this brings up a massive procedural anxiety for me.
What's that?
If the system demands this level of economic fairness, and the evidentiary bar is so high, the entire thing relies on the absolute integrity of the judges.
Right. The human element.
Yeah, and human beings are inherently corruptible. How does a 7th century text prevent a wealthy, well-connected politician from just buying his way out of that firewall? I mean, a system is only as reliable as the operator running it.
The source material actually anticipates the psychological corruption of the judiciary, which brings us to the phrase that is perhaps the most heavily weaponized by critics of the text.
لا تَكُتْكُمْ بِهِمَا غَفَةٌ فِي دِينِ اللَّهِ.
Let not pity for them move you in a matter of God's religion.
I have to be honest. When you read that phrase in a vacuum, it sounds chilling.
It really does.
It sounds like a mandate for psychopathy. It sounds like the text is saying, turn off your empathy, be ruthless, and strike hard.
It absolutely sounds like that if you read it with the vocabulary of modern emotional therapy. But remember, we are reading this as systems engineers analyzing a legal framework.
Right. So in the context of a judicial bench, what does pity actually mean?
Well, if a judge is operating a mathematically precise system, pity would mean overriding the evidence based on an emotional reaction.
Ah.
Precisely. Refutun pity, in this specific legal context, does not mean a lack of basic human empathy. It means the corruption of the legal process due to personal bias, nepotism, or social pressure.
Oh, that is fascinating.
The verse is a direct, blaring warning to the judiciary. Do not let your personal relationships or the high social standing of the accused pervert the impartial application of the law.
This makes perfect sense when you look at how white-collar crime is treated today. If a wealthy CEO embezzles millions, destroying pensions, the judge often looks at them, someone who probably went to the same universities, belongs to the same country clubs, and feels pity.
Yep. They say, oh, this person has a bright future, they made a mistake, let's just give them probation.
But a poor kid steals a car, and they get 10 years.
That is exactly the kind of pity the text is outlawing. A justice system that is harsh and uncompromising to the poor and disenfranchised, but gentle and pitiful to the wealthy and powerful, is not a justice system at all.
It is a caste system masquerading as law.
Yes. The command to not show pity is actually a command to protect the integrity of the law against the corrosive influence of power and privilege.
It's a mandate for absolute, unflinching consistency. The standard of proof is the standard of proof, whether the defendant is a king or a street sweeper.
The text reinforces this elsewhere, too. It demands that witnesses stand firm for justice, even if it goes against themselves, their wealthy peers, or even their own parents.
You cannot bend the law out of misplaced sentimentality.
No, you can't. And furthermore, look at the end of verse 2. It requires a group of believers to actually witness the punishment.
Critics always paint that as a demand for a medieval spectacle, right? Like a bloodthirsty mob cheering on the violence.
But think about the psychology of the state's monopoly on violence. What happens when a single executioner or a single jailer administers punishment in a dark cell, hidden from public view?
You get Abu Ghraib. You get black sites.
Exactly. When there is no oversight, the state actor descends into sadism and abuse.
So the requirement for a group to witness the event is actually a public accountability measure.
It is a citizen oversight committee. They are not there to cheer. They are there to ensure the state actor administering the Jaldah does not act with excessive personal vengeance.
To make sure they strictly follow the non-lethal protocols.
Right. They are watching the state, keeping its violence strictly within legal limits. It is a transparency mechanism to prevent arbitrary torture.
I am just amazed by how every element that initially looks like a primitive weapon actually reveals itself to be a mechanism for accountability when you look at the whole board.
It's all about systemic balance.
But I do want to push back on this idea of rigid consistency.
Okay, go ahead.
We've established the law applies to everyone equally. But sociology tells us that people do not start life equally. The playing field is never level.
That's a very fair point.
So does this rigid system account for inherent systemic disadvantages? No. If someone is born into a marginalized class, does the system recognize their lack of privilege?
This is perhaps the most breathtaking sociological variable in the entire text. It is literally centuries ahead of its time.
Really? How does it handle it?
The source material explicitly addresses the punishment for enslaved women, meaning women who, in that historical context, lacked proper upbringing, were denied education, lacked economic freedom, and possessed minimal social capital.
Okay, so what happens when the most marginalized person in the society is brought before this impossible evidentiary firewall, and somehow the 4 witnesses actually prove the crime?
If an enslaved woman commits the exact same crime of zina, and the impossible evidentiary bar is met, her punishment is exactly half the punishment of a free, resourced woman.
Wait, 50 stripes instead of 100?
50 strikes.
Let me make sure I'm hearing this correctly. She receives less punishment specifically because she has less privilege.
Exactly half.
That is, that completely inverts how we think about criminal justice.
It does.
Look at modern, highly developed Western justice systems. What happens today? If you are poor, uneducated, and rely on an overworked public defender, you get the book thrown at you.
You get the maximum sentence.
But if you are wealthy, highly educated, and have immense social capital, you hire a pristine legal team and get off with a warning or a slap on the wrist. We literally punish the vulnerable more harshly for lacking resources.
We criminalize poverty. But this text is mathematically adjusting legal penalties based on socioeconomic privilege.
So higher social capital, better education, and greater economic resources demand a higher level of behavioral accountability.
And conversely, lower social capital and lack of education mathematically equate to lower accountability.
It acknowledges that a woman raised with all the benefits of a society's wealth and education has a higher threshold of responsibility to maintain that society's order.
Yes. But if the society denied someone developmental resources, it cannot hold them to the same standard of perfection.
Because the society failed her first. So the legal system must mathematically mandate grace in its application.
It is the ultimate proof that the law operates purely on sociology, not blind, unthinking dogma. It is a highly calibrated sliding scale of justice.
Which means the ultimate goal of the system isn't really the physical punishment at all.
No, not at all. The primary mechanism is psychological rehabilitation.
It's about reforming the individual.
Right. If you read the surrounding verses, the source specifies that if a person repents, reforms their behavior, and proves their intent to reintegrate positively into society, they are granted grace.
The state is commanded to accept their reform.
Yes. The flogging is the absolute last resort, the final fail-safe for the completely unrepentant outlier who insists on publicly destroying social cohesion. Reform is always the default.
So, bringing all these threads together, we've gone from the linguistic roots of a skin-deep deterrent to the mythological virus of the stoning goat.
Quite a journey.
We've examined the mathematically impossible 4-witness firewall, the macroeconomic requirements of Umar's camel, the true definition of judicial pity, and the algorithm of privilege.
We covered the whole board.
When you step back and look at the whole operating system, what does Surah An-Nur Ayat 2 actually demand from a society?
It demands what is known as the law of requital mukafat e amal.
Which means what exactly?
It's the principle that actions and systems have inevitable consequences. If a state tries to run the terminal punishment, the flogging, without first building the marriage facilitation economy, without eliminating poverty-driven sex work,
without constructing the four-witness evidential standard that makes arbitrary application impossible.
exactly. If they skip all that, it will not produce a just Islamic society.
You produce a nightmare. You produce the exact dystopian images we see on the news.
You produce the exact opposite of the outcomes the Surah promises. Applying the punishment without the architecture is not Islamic law.
It is just state violence dressed up in Islamic language.
The law of requital responds to the reality of the architecture you built, not to the religious label you slap on the building.
This verse is not a flogging schedule. It is a massive, incredibly demanding social engineering project.
It really is. It commands a society to remove economic barriers. It commands the elimination of extreme poverty.
It mandates building an impartial judiciary that cannot be bought by the rich or weaponized against the poor.
It forces us to ask a terrifying question of any state that wants to wield power. What have you built for your citizens before you ask for the right to punish them?
And that leaves us with one final provocative thought to mull over today.
Let's hear it.
We spend so much time debating how to punish crime. But if a modern society actually achieved all of the prerequisites demanded by this 7th century text—
if they actually built the operating system.
Right. If a state completely eradicated poverty-driven desperation, if it removed all economic barriers to human connection, and if it ensured perfect legal equality where the rich were held to an even higher standard than the poor, how many of the behaviors we currently classify and police as crimes would simply cease to exist on their own?